Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. On this episode, we're going to be playing with the roof lining. Now a while ago, we pulled the roof lining out before we started all the panel work and all that. All in order to build the interior here. But we've been a little distracted for a little while playing with all the bodywork. But now that's done, we can now get back on the interior. So the plan is do roof lining all in this flannel material. So definitely not the standard material you use for a roof lining, but this is going to make the interior stand out quite well. So I have my old roof lining on the bench here, and after you've removed it from the car, I still have all my bars still in their pockets just as it was when it came out. So the first thing you want to do after you have this on the bench or on the floor or wherever, you want to number every seam. So on each panel, you want to number 1 and 1 on the corresponding side of the seam, and then 2, and so forth, all the way up until you get to the end where you only have 1 number on there. As well, you want to go get the bars and you want to number every bar. So what I do, only one side of the bars, you put a stripe mark for every one. So 1 mark is bar number 1, 2 marks bar number 2, and so on. That way you know which bar corresponds to which seam. And by labeling only one side, you can identify which side of the vehicle that corner and that end of the bar is meant to live. Now that we have our bars marked, labeled, we can flip our roof lining over and we can take a note of the different pockets we have on the back. So the majority of the pockets are one side the whole length, but as you can see on the back, we're wider on the outside, narrows down in the center, and has a cutout. So that cutout will attach to a hook on the roof. So if you're playing with your own roof lining, you have to be aware that some roof linings will have that hook either on all the bars or sometimes just 1 or 2 of the bars. I also like to just mark the side of the roof that the bars have the numbers on. So all the bars are labeled down this side. So I've just marked this side of the car with a hash mark, and that'll save any confusion when we go back to fit this thing. So now the other areas are labeled. We figured out what's going on with our pockets. Now what we can do, we need to put a mark where these pockets end. So grab a pen, pencil, whatever you want. Just either side of the pocket, you want to mark where they end. So these will be important later. And we can do that on every one of these pockets. After we've got marks at the end of the pocket and everything else is up to date, we can now unpick all these seams. So this one's a little different in its makeup, but the process is pretty similar. So this one, it's all been welded. So from factory, this is laid out in one piece and then pinched and welded. But it's not a commonplace in the automotive world, but in the patrols, they all seem to be done that way. But when we put these together, we're going to do it differently. So I'm going to take my scissors and we're going to cut these pockets off. So it's important that we keep these pockets to actually replicate. So on yours, you probably have a seam to unpick and some stitching, so you want to unpick that. So you want to move the thread rather than cutting the material itself. For anyone doing a roof lining where the pockets are welded in, we want to trim them off in full. We want to try to preserve their shape. And that will give us a base to replicate our new pockets on our new roof. And after we've removed our pockets, we can split the seam. Right down the center of the weld, we can separate it. Alright, now I've got this pocket separated. All the remaining pockets are all identical sizes and widths, so we can replicate these just by measurement. So if your roof lining is the same, but all these little pockets are exactly the same and exactly flat, we can take a measurement and just reproduce that size later on. So all the other ones are not as critical, and we can just split them as they are. And as we remove our panels, we want to try to keep everything organized and together and put them somewhere safe. We're not going to be damaged or trampled, because the cleaner and more intact we can keep these old panels, the easier our job for the next steps are going to be. So on these, we've got a couple panels that are a little bit different to the others. And these ones here, they have these extra long strips that go down the pillars. So if this was going to remain just a vinyl roof, then I would keep these in play as they are. But because I'm changing this up a little bit, this is going to be the flannel material, and this is going to be the black synthetic leather, vinyl, whatever you want to call it. That's going to be there. Because these areas are going to be more exposed to sun damage, and the vinyl is going to be UV stabilized, whereas the flannel material is not designed to see direct sunlight. So these will be the black vinyl, these are going to be the flannel, but I will not be sewing the vinyl to the flannel. So there's a couple of reasons for this, but I'll have to explain it in detail when we get up to that stage. So for now, I'm going to chop these off and stick them aside to use at a later time. If you're doing all vinyl roof, you can unpick those or cut them as they are and use these as a pattern and reattach them later to do it as standard. But for me, I'm doing it a slightly different way. Now all these panels are being separated. What we want to do at this stage, fold everything exactly in half so that we can figure out our center. I usually just snip a little triangle out of it so that the center can be seen easily from both sides of the material. And we can do that to every single panel. Now it's come time to start marking out our new panels. So using our old panels that we have cut from the old roof, we are going to use them as a template. So there's a few tricks to doing this well. So a lot of these over the time, they've been in there for several decades and they're distorted and not exactly true to what they are. So I have a few tricks that I like to use that helps the process. More often than not, these will actually be a series of straight lines more than constant radius bends. So this back here, I'm going to assume that it is completely straight. It is very close to the edge of the steel bar here, so I am going to assume it is going to be straight. So I'm using quite a flexible and not very stable material that has a lot of complex patterns in it. Using something like this complicates things to a degree. So the way I go about using these materials is I find the true center of the material, which for me happens to land right there. So I'm using a tailor's chalk to mark these material. That can be just taken off with a bit of compressed air and maybe some a lightly damp rag. So if you're using a vinyl, you can simply trace it on the back side of the vinyl using a lead pencil. Just making sure when you use your pattern that you've got it the correct way round. All right, back to where we were. So as we are using this complex material, because it's very unstable, it is nearly impossible to lay a straight edge and draw a completely straight line true to the pattern in there. So what I am going to use is these patterns on the material itself. So I'm going to follow one of these lines, and regardless whether or not the line sits flat on the bench, I'm going to assume that pattern is going to be dead straight. So as I'm marking this, I'm going to line up the edge of the material with one of these lines. So I'm going to assume this red line, that is going to be my stitch point in my seam. And because I've cut dead center on the joint of the seam, I need to make an allowance for our stitching, or our seam allowance. So from here, I'm going to go 10 millimeters, 1 centimeter, approximately just on the outside of this white line here. And that's where I'm going to make my line, make my cut. So for our friends over United States, Britain, or wherever uses the imperial system, it's probably about 3/8 of an inch, or some people like to use 1/2 an inch, which is about 12.5 millimeters. One thing worth noting is a lot of these complex pattern materials, there is a good side and a bad side. So this side we're looking at now is the good side. And the way we tell is as we get nice and close to the stitching, we can see the detail is very sharp and very clear. Whereas we go to the back side, is a lot softer, a lot blurrier, and just doesn't have that crisp, sharp pattern to it. So that's one way to tell which side is your good side and which side is your bad side. We're going to be assuming that this pattern is dead flat across this seam. Now this here goes to the rear of the vehicle, and there is no seam this way. So I always allow extra material over what was there exactly. You never want to cut exactly on its existing cut mark, because your pattern never sits 100% the same as the material that came out. So you want to give yourself room for error. So I always like to allow at least an additional inch, maybe even more. But because this is the rear of the vehicle, I'm probably gonna just cut it dead flat about that line there. And because the seam is approximately flat, I'm going to be cutting exactly on this mark here, and that's going to be my panel number 8. So the panel's cut out now. I've just drawn a very slight guide on there, so it gives me a better idea of where the seam is. Also on the back side of the material, I've drawn myself a number 8 so I know which panel is which. And the last thing we need to do is mark our center and mark the edge of our pockets there. As you finish marking out a piece, you want to set that separate to the panels that you are still yet to mark out. That will help prevent you from marking duplicate panels. This is the next panel, second from the back. As you can see, there is change of directions here. So this one here, we can't assume the whole thing was originally straight, because we'd be wrong. But what we can do is assume there are multiple different angles of straight sections. And we've got to keep in mind that this material is unstable and likes to move about. So as we draw our sections of straight line, we have to make sure that our straight lines are in line with the pattern. So I'm going to assume between these areas here are straight. And as the direction changes, instead of trying to draw a radius, it's going to be another straight line. And then we have another change of direction, which again will be another straight line. If you get a very sharp change of direction, you can add a very small radius to the corner. But I find it's very uncommon to have a very constant arc in these. Most of them are a series of different angled straight lines. I find every time you do a constant arc, you end up with loose bits in the roof as you try to tension it all out. So this is my preference, to use a series of straight lines to make a shape. And now that we've got this shape here, we can look at this other side. Which is very close to straight. But as you can see at the top here, just from this point to this point here, it's a very mild change of direction. So I'm going to draw a straight line from this point across. So we have our shape up here, then we can follow this existing line on the pattern, and we're going to cut down to center. We're going to stop on center. Now we're going to turn this over. We're going to mark 7 and 8. We can also mark our stop mark for our pockets as well. Now that we've cut to center, we can fold this over and we can line the pattern up going the other way. Now if you're using a stable material, this step is a lot easier. If you're using a vinyl, all you need to do is fold it over its center. If you have this straight line here, you run that straight line all the way through, and you just put that edge to a straight line that you've already drawn. And once you have it folded in half, all you need to do is trace it and do a mirror image of the first side that you marked out. And that will give you two very even, very symmetrical sides. So for the rest of the panels, they're all variations of the same technique I have just shown you. So if you're using a vinyl, this job is going to be a lot easier for you. Just when you choose your vinyl, you want to choose a nice thin one that has plenty of stretch in it. So there's lots of different vinyls out there. Most vinyls will still work, even the thicker vinyls will work. They're just a little bit more challenging when it comes time to fitting them in the vehicle. But I'm going to jump back on these. I'm going to finish marking out the rest of the panels, and I'll throw you on the time lapse. All the flano has been marked out. We can now start working on our pockets. So this was my only pocket that had a bit of shape to it. And all my other ones were all just a constant width across. So as notice from now, we're going to make it out of a very light material. Now the material I'll use is a calico. It's very similar to like a light sheet material, but it gives you plenty of stretch. And you want it to be able to move freely so that it doesn't interfere with the shape of your main panels. What you also want to do is when you cut these, you want to cut them on the bias. So you want to go up on the angle. Because if you look on the bench, you have a little bit of stretch across. It's not too bad. Up the roll, you have no stretch. But on the angle, you have a lot of stretch. So these roof linings in particular, you want to cut it on the angle. So we have our straight line that we're going to start with, and we can mark a pattern from there. So we have a closer look of this pocket here. We can see the top side is straight, where the seam itself is curved. So you want to take note of that when you're marking out a replacement. So we're going to put the top or the center of the pocket along that line. From there, we can mark our pocket, remembering to allow for our seam, our stitch allowance or seam allowance, whatever you want to call it, your 1/2 inch, 1 centimeter, whatever you're using, as long as it is consistent. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that out. Now I have the outside seam marked on here, and this is going to be the top side or the center of the pocket. But we need to duplicate this to the other side. So all I'm going to do is cut it along this line here, and I'm going to fold it on that line and replicate the same mark across. So the shape pocket is now complete. It's sitting over the other side. Now for these other pockets, because they're consistent in size, all we're going to do is measure the width, and we have 20 mil finished, and then we need to add 10 millimeters for the seam allowance, which makes it 30. Fold that in half, we'll cut it at 60 mil. So I'm going to go ahead, mark up a bunch of lengths, probably cut more than I need because these pockets are pretty common to use in interior work. So I'm going to cut out about 10 of them. And we are ready to start joining our pieces here. So we can start lining up with seam number 1, with seam number 1. All right, that's written somewhere. We can line up seam 2 with seam number 2. And at the same time as we are sewing the seams, we will be stitching in at the same time our pockets for our bars. So anyone that's attempting this at home, I would recommend getting a industrial sewing machine similar to this. This is a FAF 545. It's a good all-round machine. For a lightweight material like this, you could potentially get away with just your household sewing machine. If it's a heavier one, I would opt for the heaviest thread, the biggest thread that you can fit in the machine, and potentially even sew it twice, every seam twice. So I have used a household machine in the past. They're very limited as far as this upholstery work goes, but if you sew the seam twice, you should be okay, because the last thing you want is to be feeding it in the roof of the car and a seam to burst. Another thing you want to be aware of when you're sewing these up yourself is that you can't start sewing anywhere you want. You need to have the materials aligned correctly. So in previous steps, we marked a center mark and a couple marks at the end of the material where the pocket is meant to end. So it's important. These marks are not only important to know where the pocket ends, but where the two pieces join up when you're sewing your seam. So when you're putting it together, you're going to make sure you line your center up, and then you can line up your marks for your pocket. So can't really see the pocket marks on these because of the patterns. It gets lost in the pattern itself. But if you're using a vinyl, most people will be using vinyl. You'll be able to see them clear as day. The most important mark that you want to line up is the center mark. So that's gonna align everything true in the car for you. Depending how your marking up goes on the bench, you might find that your end of pocket mark has a little bit of discrepancy. I wouldn't be very concerned about that. If it's over an inch away, then yes, you might want to double check to your pattern. But if it's within a centimeter of it, it should be okay, provided that your center mark lines up correctly when you sew. When you're working with a pattern like this, it's very important that you line the pattern up from one piece to the next. Otherwise, if your pattern's off slightly, you will be able to see clear as day if you didn't get your stitching correctly. So you need to pay much more attention to get the pattern to line up correctly. Now you can run your pocket a little bit further than your mark, so we can always trim this back later when we're fitting it to the cut. I like to stitch in several inches before I start laying the pattern, the pocket, sorry. I typically like to put the pocket under the seam when I'm sewing. This allows me to keep an eye on the material, making sure everything is lining up as it should. If need be, you can sew the seam first and come back and sew the pocket on after. A lot of people do find it easier that way. So you've got all my pockets attached, and you see the rear has its shaped pocket. So the rear had a slit in the center that hooks over to this little section over there. So now what we need to do, you need to grab our bars, slot them into the pockets in the corresponding number. If you remember, we labelled the bars in order from front to back, remembering which side the numbering has to go. Now we have the roof all joined together, ready to go back into the car. In the next episode, I will show you how to install the suspended roof lining into your car.